Actually, we're in the Hudson Yards Hell's Kitchen Alliance space, part of Theater Row. The Drama School is really honored to walk into 2020 by engaging so many of our members, theater practitioners, policy stakeholders, and people who are thinking about how we can change and reimagine the United States going into 2020. It's really what we're doing. We're so honored this evening to present a panel discussion on voter disenfranchisement in Native communities. Because we understand that theater stakeholders have something to say and have something to contribute in terms of creating new realities and new visions of what we can do and where we can go. And we hope that what happens today, we have so many of our 8,000 members who are online. Hello, everyone. And we hope that you'll be able to follow us on Twitter. And if you have questions, we do have Zach, we have Terry, and I'm going to get on shortly. Please send it by Twitter, and we'll share it with our participants today. As moderator, we have Rhiana Yazzie, Navajo Playwright and founder of the New Native Theater. We have Nick Tilsen from the Oglala Lakota Nation, President and CEO of the Indian Collective. We have Jerome Joseph, is it
Gentes.
Gentes, Lakota and Gros, playwright, composer, creative director of Tiger Bear Productions. We have Murielle, Borst, Tarrant, Kuna, Rappahannock nations, playwright, director, human rights activist. And online, we have Dr. Vibrina Coronado, who will be sharing her ideas with us as well. And I'll let Rhiana start.
All right. Thank you, Jenna. Thank you, Jenna, and thanks, Joey. Thanks to the Dramatists Guild for wanting to talk about this subject. So we'll just jump in. I don't think that it's going to be a conversation that's necessarily doom and gloom, because I really believe, and I think that we've seen in this country, that Native people are on the leading edge of making change. A lot of the thought work that we've done goes deep into what become the left's politics. So I'm just thinking of everybody taking their notes now. So we want to, I guess I just wanted to start off with maybe folks just sort of saying who they are, and then we'll just sort of jump in. Can you start?
Oh, you want me to start? Oh, hello, everybody. Noede. My name is Murielle Borst Tarrant. That's my my English name. The name that was given to me is Oglala, which means I have permission to speak in public. I am a playwright, a cultural artist, actor, and a director. I'm artistic director of Safe Harbors Indigenous Collective here in New York City. Our mandates are advocating for Native theater nationally and internationally when we can. We really focus on what it means to be a repertory theater company, and how do we take that craft, and how do we as Native artists and theater makers, how do we focus on craft, and how does craft work for us? And so we can tell our stories not through the colonizer's lens, but through our lens, and what of our stories and our importance. We also believe that we do not have separate mandates. We believe that the politics of what happens in this country, and the politics that happens within theater itself, and what is being on stage as a sacred space, as any cultural activist thinks of theater, is that these are not separate issues. Human rights, voting issues, constitutional rights, UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the doctrine of discovery. These are all different things, are not different things. They're all related to each other. Health issues, storytelling. We also let everybody understand too that the reason that urban Native people are alive and well here in New York City, and in many cities, And we are now telling those stories about the boarding school stories and those who had to be relocated and those who had to come into New York City area. I'm so happy that Rhiana has asked me to be here because this is not really my mandate. And she really wanted me here to talk about what, because I worked internationally for 10 years at the United Nations, Special Assistant in Northern Rep, and I was chairwoman of North America. And during that time, we talked about how does constitutional rights domestically versus the international mandates. What we have noticed is that most Native peoples, they don't understand that you have to exhaust domestically before you go into internationally. And if I can say that, I'm very honored to sit here with these people who have their life's work has been on voter issues and working with community engagement. And I feel very honored that I was asked to be here. Thank you.
Are we going down there?
Sure.
Okay. Hi, I'm Jerome Joseph Gentes. I am Lakota and Gros. I'm here from the San Francisco Bay Area where I work in tech, actually. Tech in the technological, in this sense, not the theater sense. I always have to make that a little clear, although a little bit of both. And thank you to the Drummers Guild and Rhiana for facilitating this, and to those who are here listening online. I have more questions about even my presence here than statements, but because I'm fairly new to theater, I still think of myself as fairly new to theater and playwriting in particular, although it's been now maybe about 8 years that I've been actively involved. I started Tiger Bear Productions earlier this year to foster work that I think isn't getting lifted up the way it should be. We are located in Palm Springs in the Coachella Valley, which has a rich Native history. And in fact, as it happens, we're based on Indian land, the Agua Caliente tribe out there. Although that's not my own tribe, I'm seeking to engage with that for sure going forward, because as you can imagine, there's the surface of Palm Springs, which is very swimming pools, movie stars kind of thing, and then there's the old, rich culture and land that lies underneath all of that. Being in California, I was adopted at birth, almost at birth, so I'm also have an interesting narrative of my own about engaging as a blood Indian with my own identity, and it's really been in the past few years that I was like, damn it, I'm an Indian too, and I must have a story to tell and a story to write, and if I can't do that, maybe I can lift up other voices. And I just have to say, Murielle remembered me. We met, I don't want to say how long ago it was, but she looks exactly the same, and I don't, and I'm so flattered that she remembered meeting. So thank you.
Thank you, Jerome.
Hamadakyapi, Nick Tilsen Amachapi, Chante Awashte Nape Chuzapalo. My name is Nick Tilsen, and I greet you in my Lakota language. And I come from the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, home to the Oglala Lakota people, and father of 4 wild Oglala kids. And I currently work for an organization and help found an organization called the Indian Collective, Indian, and we're a national organization that's dedicated to building Indigenous power, and we're doing that by challenging white supremacy and philanthropy in the world of investment and community organizing and advocacy. And we're a collective of Indigenous organizers, activists, social entrepreneurs, culture bearers, storytellers, all kinds of different hodgepodge of Indigenous folks. And many of us have engaged in the civic engagement process and democratic process, and some of us have been engaged in some of the closest elections in the history of the country before. And so this issue is very close to home as it relates to building Indigenous power as one of the ways that we engage in this work. And we also believe most of all the work that I've ever been involved in engages art, culture, and culture bearers, and has been the foundation of most of the work that I've been involved in the past. It's funny because I actually don't identify myself as an artist, but as a culture bearer in my community, absolutely. And been part of building a movement of reconnecting a lot of young people to culture, spirituality, and identity. And so now doing this work with the Indian Collective and uplifting and supporting other Indigenous communities and organizations. And we also fund Indigenous artists to radically imagine the future that we're fighting for, and have some exciting work that we're rolling out in 2020 around that we're actually still pondering. We were pondering it on the way here. So anyway, that's a little bit about myself.
Thank you, Nick. And Vibrina, got you on the iPad.
Yeah, hi. My name is Vibrina Coronado. I am Lumbee on my mother's side and Mexican American on my father's side. And I actually grew up in Banning, so I'm real familiar with the native area in Palm Springs. So that was kind of nice to hear about. I am trained as an academic, so a lot of my work is kind of looking at theater and performance from an academic point of view, but the work I'm doing mainly now and kind of my, my side, I don't want to say side hustle, because I've always done kind of scholarly stuff as well as practice along the same time. So I'm working in my community, my Lumbee community, trying to produce plays that are written by native Lumbee playwrights. And I'm actually working on a piece myself, but I'm less interested in my own work and more interested in trying to find ways to support Lumbee writers, playwrights, technicians, things like that, to help them understand what it means to create performance and how performance can really make culture and support recovery in every kind of way you want to define recovery. I am working with some people who are in recovery from alcohol and drug addiction, so that's kind of interesting to think about that, both in terms of just recovery in a more general way, and how performance and theater can help facilitate recovery. And I could say a lot more, but that's kind of probably enough. Except that it's been really interesting to work with people who don't have a lot of training, but still come and are very enthusiastic about doing the work.
Thank you, Vibrina.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I remember meeting when you used to live in Minneapolis when I first went out there.
Yes, I remember that. Yeah, I'm so excited about all the work you've been doing all these years. Yeah, it's been great.
I'm excited about what you're doing. And then I will talk just a little bit about myself. I'm a playwright who got into running a theater company, and the theater company is called New Native Theater. It's based in the Twin Cities in Minnesota, and we are celebrating our 10th anniversary right now. So a lot of times we will start off with a land acknowledgement. I'm not really empowered to really do a land acknowledgement. One thing that we've been thinking a lot about in Minneapolis, in lieu of the land acknowledgement, which I personally feel often absolves everyone who hears it, is to instead ask some questions. So I'm going to ask you guys to consider some questions as you listen to the gifts, talent, and knowledge that you're going to experience this evening. Why are you here? What will you do with this information? How will you acknowledge the people you've heard this information from? And how will you replace the gifts, talents, and treasures that you're taking from here tonight? And a question here that I'm inspired by Nick is, how will you use what you've learned tonight to build Indigenous power? All right. So we've been asked to talk about voter disenfranchisement. I think it would be really fantastic to talk just a little bit about the context of Native people voting in this thing called the United States in general. We got the right to vote in 1924. We got the federal right, and that, I think we were the last group to get that. However, that didn't mean that Native people could entirely vote. Then there was, in 1933, there was the Reorganization Act. So then some states allowed Native people to vote, and then Utah was the last state to allow Native people to vote, and that was in 1962. And we were talking over dinner. Michael, who's over here, who didn't introduce himself, I might get him to introduce himself, was we were talking about how really the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s really was the time at which Native people fully got the right to vote. So Native voter, I just sort of want to also just sort of give more of a context of what Native people are doing and the power that we have. So the 2020 election that's coming up, there are 7 swing states that can be highly affected by the number of Native voters who come out in 2020. So Nevada, which has 32 tribal nations, Arizona, which has 20, Wisconsin has 11, Michigan 11, North Carolina has 8, North Dakota has 5, and South Dakota has 8 tribal nations. Some of the things that we've seen in the past regarding Native voter disenfranchisement have been the ways that Native people have, of course, historically not even been able to vote. And then also the barriers such as so many Native nations being very rural. Sometimes there are voting places that are up to 100 miles away, which is the closest polling station. Other times, polling stations, there's an example in Rosebud, South Dakota, where a polling station was set up in a chicken coop. It was also, there was a police officer with his hands on his guns. Michael was telling me this story. Actually, maybe I should just sort of hand it off to you, Michael.
It was in the 2014 elections. The county sheriff stood outside of the polling place and just basically stood there blocking the door for the whole day. And it's just, kind of an overt intimidation tactic of the community there.
Yeah, and then of course the thing that we've heard a lot recently, at least that I've heard, is how enforcing voter ID laws makes it practically impossible for many Native people to vote because, for instance, in North Dakota, the current law is that you have to have your address on your license that you present on your ID. But so many people in rural areas don't actually have the physical address. So is there more context that anybody else wants to sort of add to this?
I mean, I'll add a little historical context about like the whole relationship between Native people and this so-called democracy that we're in. I mean, Native people's entry in relationship to the democracy was that we were at war with this country over our own land. And so Indians were dealt with within the Department of War. And and there was over 700-800 different treaties that were signed with indigenous people, and 100% of those treaties were broken. What people don't realize is that in the breaking of those treaties, the U.S. Constitution was also broken, because Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution states that treaties are the supreme law of the land. So this was our entry into this democracy. And then, of course, we didn't even become citizens until 1924. And we didn't get the quasi-right to vote until between 1932 and 1933. And then in 1934 was the Indian Reorganization Act, in which reorganized its relationship to indigenous people. That created the current tribal governance systems that are now in place, which was another form of colonial government. It wasn't governments that came from us. And then I think like the other reality of how decisions were made, like how democracy was, or the American form of democracy was forced upon Native people. So like if you take on Pine Ridge alone, how we made decisions was that there was people that were head of families. To be honest, this whole idea of like a chief of a tribe, that's actually a foreign colonial concept. We had heads of families. The idea of creating one tribe for our one chief for a whole nation, that was actually for the colonizers' benefit, because it made it easier to say, well, who speaks for all of you? And everybody's like, well, I only speak for my family, and collectively we speak for our nation. But of course, the government was like, "That's too complicated. We need a chief of all of this," and that's where that came from. And so I think like imposed democratic values and democracy values on indigenous people there's such a long history of reality that we have been battling against there, and I think that those contexts are really important. And if you look at sort of how the democracy is set up between tribal sovereignty and localities and states not really having the political power over indigenous people, because our relationship to the federal government is largely nation-to-nation relationship, but that's the original intention. So the same relationship that states have with the federal government was the intended relationship for tribes to have with the federal government. Yet tribe states have been a long time imposing their jurisdictions onto indigenous people and continuing colonization in that way. So these things are, not to go down a history lesson, but they're the things that the political context and the political complexities in which we find ourselves in now. And then of course, our relatives that are urban too. You have over half of all of Indian countries in urban places. And so many of how Indians ended up in urban places came from relocation and a termination era in which they were terminating tribal sovereignty and relocating folks to urban areas. And so these are all contexts that people have to, that we have to realize as we're entering into modern conversations around voter disenfranchisement that's happening today in places like North Dakota, South Dakota, Nevada, Utah, different places. And then of course the context of voter disenfranchisement that's happening in urban centers and places too.
Yeah, I agree. I think also what happens too is that indigenous peoples and native peoples are extremely complex, right? So here we are, and you mentioned land acknowledgement. Here we are in the middle of Manhattan, and there's 9 nations that surround this one. Area. I had the great opportunity to work with the Grand Council of Chiefs of the Haudenosaunee Nation, and a big part of my training was to understand what diplomacy means and what does that mean to us. And a big part of that with the chief system, which is part of something that is not a, and everyone has, and we have to remember this, is that people don't understand there's not one way here. right? And this is where people get really in trouble. Like, no one's contradicting each other. We all have different ways. We have different ways of praying. We have different ways of speaking. We have different color textures. We have different hair textures. We have different languages, religious beliefs. The great law of peace is very different from what happens. So, we're talking about these different things that happen, and everyone wants one answer from us. And it doesn't work that way, right? And what I always, and one of the things, and I agree with my brother here, is that I am not a clan mother. I'm not a chief. I'm not a chairwoman. I'm not a councilwoman. I'm a Native woman who comes from a matriarchal society that is with my family and making decisions for my nonprofit, which is a theater company, right? And so, and we're always put into these places when we're just, I always say, we're just trying to really survive our culture, being culture bearers, trying to figure out what culture bearer means to us, right? And not being lost in the mix of this place of New York City, and people understanding just because one Native person says one thing, it doesn't mean it's the end all to every answer, right? And I think that's what happens historically, right? As we're saying, talk about colonialism, right? And in people who talk about patriarchy, they're always saying, oh, let's stop the patriarchy, whatever. Meanwhile, you're saying something that's so patriarchal that's part of the colonization, right? So, and these are Native people that sometimes say that, and you're like, well, you just said you're not part of the patriarchy, right? But then again, you want us to say all of these different things that are politically correct and everything. And meanwhile, we have a right, and I truly believe this, we have a right to exist as any other human being. We have a right because every human being in this world is born with dignity. And we have a right to live in dignity, and we have a right to make a living as our self-determination and our sovereignty permits. And that includes our voting rights. You made the rules, we're going by them next time, because equality is not for some people, it is for all people. And that is where I stand with this. Is it hard to, as a sovereign, someone who does come from a sovereign nation, how do I deal with that? Well, part of it is, what is sovereignty to me? We're also all born with sovereignty in our own rights, right? My self-determination is for me to vote on the international fora. That is our rights as human beings on this earth, and legally.
And how are Indigenous people voting and working with the UN? Is the Indigenous vote globally?
Well, what happens is that, and this is what happens a lot, is that we talk about we say two words, and I'm giving myself away here. Everyone yells at me for saying this, but they come to us and they say, this is urgent, or this is critical. And you come into our communities and you're saying that, and I'm talking about rural communities and even urban communities. You come into this community here in New York City and say, this is urgent that we do this. Well, we want health care, right? We don't have a clinic set up here, right? If you go into a rural community and you say, what is urgent? We need running water. We need sustainability for economic sovereignty. That is what's important to us, right? So what happens is we go to the UN, which happens 2 weeks in either April or May, and they want to talk about these domestic issues. You have to understand, the UN is international, right? So you have to, and even the word indigenous is something that is an international word, so legally we can collectively fight against bigger member states and systems, right? So we can agree to disagree, and we sign on to one another. So the process is slow, but all governance is slow. And we have to remember that. There are people who say, oh, I really want to talk at the UN, and I want, okay, well, this is the process. Well, it's so slow, I don't know what to say. This is the process if you want to go in that area, right? And I believe what's extremely important wasn't so long ago when you say this that, really, maybe one of you can back me up. How soon was it since we were outlawed that we couldn't speak our language and we couldn't sing and dance? That's not very long ago.
1978.
And we all remember that. So when they say, oh, you're so sensitive about stuff, you're damn right. I remember, I think it's something that, we have a revitalization of language, right? Meanwhile, I lived in a household, everyone spoke their native tongue. My mother understood it. And there's a reason why I don't speak fluent. The boarding schools did their jobs. Right? And I think that's why we fight so hard for our rights. And I don't think people understand that. It's not, because it's not in history books. It's not.
We have to be the ones to teach folks.
And there's a cultural exhaustion that goes with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you think about the spectrum of things that Native people are dealing with, how high on the spectrum is do Native people want to involve themselves in the colonizer's politic to vote? I'm actually going to ask Michael to introduce himself, because I need to acknowledge all of these little sound bites I've taken from you over the last hour.
Michael Johnson, I'm the Director of Advancement with the NDN Collective. I work closely with Nick. I'm a citizen of the 3 affiliated tribes of North Dakota and born and raised in Denver, Colorado.
You were saying something really interesting about one of the things that Murielle touched on is the length of time it takes for change to happen, and then also Native people in some instances are mobilized in extremely high rates to come on out, and then other instances it's like, why do I even want to bother with being involved with a completely different politic?
Well, I think, to pick up on the conversation about boarding schools, what happened with our grandparents' generation and our great-grandparents' generation as survivors of these schools, they had enough acculturation. And when the renaissance of rebuilding and revitalizing nations happened in our communities, a lot of that was internal work that we did on our own, right? And the idea being, it wasn't our place necessarily as Indigenous people to engage in colonial politics. And so there's an older generation who, a lot of them never have voted, and they never will. And I think the attitude's changing a little bit. I would argue if you have the ability to hire the person you have to interface with, that's a great opportunity. And I think that's a generational experience that I can say, and I can own that because I didn't have to deal with a boarding school era, and I didn't personally have to deal with that. So I think there's a generational lens that we can apply here too. Mm-hmm. Speaking a little more broadly, and Nick, I'd love to get you to chime in on your experience working on campaigns around this, but in the swing states where we have a large Native population, the opportunity to activate our people for a certain candidate or for a certain cause, those are those micro wins, and I think those are those things where we end up with 2 Native women in Congress for the first time in history, right? And so I know, Nick, you have a little bit you can talk about your experience in organizing.
Well, yeah, you come back to like when it works, right? Whenever we're engaging in our communities and we are doing so unencumbered, it can have monumental effects on Indigenous people's issues, but on the entire democracy as a whole. In 2002, I had the honor to be part of a pretty historic campaign in South Dakota on the Pioneer Indian Reservation, where we are in an all pretty red state out in South Dakota. There's only about 825,000 people there, but there's 9 tribes in South Dakota. The community I come from on Pine Ridge is like a Democratic stronghold because it's the 90% Native and it happens to be about 90% Democratic, and so we had Senator Tim Johnson running for re-election of that seat, and we were able to mobilize in our community. And South Dakota is kind of split, East River and West River, and it's also because they get the Missouri River that divides the state, and then you have the time zone change too. So you have Central Time Zone on part of the state, and then you have Mountain Time Zone. And so when we did massive mobilization there, that is an example where money came in for mobilization of a campaign, not last minute, where it did come in there early enough to organize, because what happens now and what happens even in the last election, which is probably going to happen in this upcoming one, is that money comes into low-income communities of color and indigenous communities way late in the game. Where when the reality is in white communities, there's money in those communities that are already happening to mobilize people way ahead of time. So that's something that we have to change. But in this particular case, we mobilized huge amounts of young people. And when the polls closed in East River, they declared John Thune, the Republican, the winner of that particular race. But they hadn't counted the Indian vote on Pine Ridge yet. And the campaign was ready to, say, oh, we lost the election. I was like, you gotta wait till you count the vote on Pine Ridge, because we literally I don't know anybody who didn't vote. We brought grandmothers to the polls, grandfathers to the polls. We had to stop at the store to pick up milk on the way. It was the only way they would vote. But we got everybody to vote. Comes to Pine Ridge, count the votes in the morning, win by 524 votes after the votes are counted on Pine Ridge. Senator Tim Johnson becomes one of the closest senatorial races in the history of the country that we won. And Senator Tim Johnson went on to be a huge advocate for Indigenous people's issues. He sat on the Indian Affairs Committee, on the Appropriations Committee, on all committees that we demanded that he sit on for us to be represented as his constituents. In his very last day, in his very last day in office, in his very last trip amongst the people as a senator, where did he go? He came to Pine Ridge. And he came into my home community on Thunder Valley. And so there's this long history, and I think that it's important for us to talk about examples like that of when this democracy is actually functioning in a way, because that tells like what we're fighting for here. Ever since that election though, we have to have poll watchers at every single precinct, because there's people there that are there to discourage the Indian vote. And so so people are coming there to discourage Indian people from voting. And so we have poll watchers in every single election for since 2002 to protect voters, to go there, because they understand that there's a political power that's building in there. As the rest of rural South Dakota is depopulating, in Native people in South Dakota's population are increasing at a 10% growth rate. And so these Indian reservations are becoming an important part of the political paradigm that so just to share that story, and I have other examples too, but I want to hold those for now.
I want to respond to that, but I know that Dr. Coronado was trying to say something, so I wanted to make sure she was heard.
Well, I can talk about North Carolina. That's where I am based. And certainly some of the things people have said are true here. When I think about voting, I also think about tribal elections as well as national elections. So, and I would say for me, and I would say a lot of people who are active in the political process, those are kind of married. Because you see a lot of people, and I'm going to talk mainly about Lumbees. I don't know so much about the other tribes in North Carolina, but that's certainly something I'll learn more about. But for instance, there's a big push for federal recognition for Lumbees. So people will go to the polls for someone who supports them. And their other platforms or other interests might not be as important. We have a lot of people who are single issue voters who unfortunately don't really look at a lot of other issues when they vote. And I mean, I've had lots of conversations with these people. Some people are friends or relatives or things. And so I think that's something that I've become more aware about in the last 2 years. And also, there are people who just don't vote because of many of the reasons. And of my generation, I have always voted, but I have family members who are around my generation who do not vote because they don't think it makes a difference. But they also feel like they can influence the tribal things in other ways that do not involve the political, I guess, the national political process. And this is someone who does not vote in either tribal elections or state or national elections. So for me, I look at all of those kinds of things, and think about how to address those things, single issue voters, for things that for me, to vote on a single issue and not look at anything else is very, very problematic, especially when the single issue might not have anything to do with tribal issues on the national level, on the state level, or even in the community level. So I keep thinking about how do we get these people to look at how their single issue interfaces with who they are as a tribal person. So that's a big thing. And then people who don't vote at all for whatever reason. Historically, people have paid people to go to the polls and vote for particular people. And I'm talking about local elections. And because I live in a very poor area, I live in a rural area. So how do we change that paradigm from people looking at voting as an economic, kind of just, okay, I'm going to get paid, kind of my vote doesn't matter that much. So that's something I've thought a lot about. I don't have an answer there. I know people in the community think a lot about that. These last elections, people did go and get people and take them to the polls, and there wasn't any kind of payment or whatever. It was just like, you want to vote, we will make sure that you are able to get to the polls. There is voter intimidation at the polls. It is not, I have never seen it as overt as some of the other speakers have talked about, but it does discourage people from going. And the whole ID thing is complicated, especially because I have, and I use it a lot, my tribal ID. And I use it every chance I get. If I can use it when I fly, I do. But it's not always recognized as a valid ID for voting. So that would be another thing I would say that creates barriers or issues, especially for people or situations where they're not used to seeing tribal IDs, or they don't think they're real, and that kind of thing. There's probably other things, but off the top of my head, those are the kinds of issues that have come up, and yeah, so I'll stop there.
So, thank you. I wanted to, it's so great to listen to all this. I tend to be the sort of person who takes it all in and kind of sparks, it really sparks ideas. And Dr. Coronado, what you just said, so I'd like to offer any help I can working in the tech community in Silicon Valley to our family and to our tribes, because I was just thinking like we should get Uber and Lyft to sponsor SUV carpools on election day to go out into rural communities, pick people up, take them to the polls and take them back. I think that would be a great, I will do that when I get back to Silicon Valley. Thank you for mentioning I didn't know that about the East River, West River thing. I'm old enough to have voted for, or I should say voted my first presidential election was 1984. And living in California, I was so excited to go to the polls for the first time and vote in a presidential election. By the time I was on my way, they had called the election for Ronald Reagan. It was the Reagan landslide.
Yeah.
And I was so, I still carry that anger of the system of media and bureaucracy kind of shutting down the importance of voting. So I feel like the more we can call those things out, the better. Was thinking, if I may say so, like even 1924, I thought about a little bit about like, what could I say here? And I sort of looked into like, what do I think voter suppression in Native communities might be and what might be some of the causes. And you were saying things like the East River, West River thing in 1924, I thought, it's so stupid that we still have this election day tied to an agrarian calendar, November, past daylight savings time. If I had to go out and vote in this darkness, I would be disinclined to do so. So by the system itself, we're suppressing not just Native voters, but lots of voters.
Yeah.
So I just was thinking of how much I like burning houses down.
What about burning houses down through stories? What are folks thinking about? Are these sparking ideas for plays for you? And how are you reimagining what our future can be?
Well, I spent my whole, I'm celebrating, 45 years on stage. So, and that's how long I've been been in this field as a director and as an actress and a performer and dancer. I believe that this is not unrelated. I think that we as Native peoples, and I said it with S collectively, is that we have to start telling our own stories, and there's no way around that. And what I mean that is that we have collectively, as a source of beings who have these wonderful stories about our life ways, right? And once again, we are not allowed at times to tell our own stories, right? In mainstream theater and mainstream television, the marginalization is beyond in this industry. So I find it doesn't surprise me, because I deal with the marginalization in this industry so much, that voter suppression is happening at the same time. Mm-hmm. Because if you keep us in the shadows, you could do what you want to us. I believe as a playwright, I have a right to tell my story, and so do many other Native people. I'm not the only writer in the world. And that's what happens, right? You have one writer, and they say, oh, we hired a Native playwright, and we checked off
for 10 years.
Diversity, And then we do this thing, and I don't know how many people are involved with EDI and equal equity and diversity and inclusion. Now, yes, I'm very glad that's there. I'm very happy that's there. But if we're going to talk equal equity, what does that mean to Native peoples? And we're seeing this with the suppression of voters. You see this. Equal equity means what? Equal equity means that we as Native peoples, right, they give everybody, all the people of color, all $1. Meanwhile, some other group is making 50 cents. Another one's making 25, and Native people are still making a penny. And then when we say, well, that's not equal equity, they say, well, that's not fair of you, right? And I think there has to be these discussions. And I think in plays, such as plays and writing articles and going in, because the first thing in a revolution, if we think revolutionary here, is the playwright and the artist are the first ones who are captured and killed, right? So I do think about that all the time, and I think also we have to talk about what does self-determination mean to us. And I think that we have to really start assessing that, so we don't have cultural exhaustion like this when these plays happen, that we have Native directors.
Right. And I also do want to call attention to what Vibrina's doing with Lumbee people, because it's not that we have to start telling our stories, because we have been, we continue to do it. But I almost wonder, are we placing, maybe this is going in a different direction, but could we put more value on the stories that we are telling? Could we ask those outside to put their gaze on us, instead of us having to go outside to top-tier theater in order to be recognized, in order to be a Native playwright, in order to be qualified for prizes and fellowships that make you a legit playwright? Mm-hmm. Nobody's coming to our communities taking a look at the amazing work that we're doing. We're not just making fantastic art, but we're changing people's lives, and we're continuing culture, and we're continuing the sovereignty of who we are. You know, I think that's pretty amazing. So I do want to ask, since we do have a big audience of non-Native people here as well, should they be telling our stories too? I mean, how are they going to?
Even allyship, and I believe, because I do live in New York City, right? And I do live in this place. I am very privileged to work on where Broadway is, right? And we have the downtown theater where all they have, and this is where I work. This is where I live, right? I know that the only way for us and the Native people in New York, I'm talking specifically New York City, is to have allies. And those allies have to understand where we're coming from, so we're not so culturally exhausted fighting all the time with non-Native producers, because that is a reality that we live in. And there's no way around it. Community engagement is something different. If you're talking specifically on what happens here in New York City, then we have to work with allyships for people who are going to support us, so we're not the only ones who are fighting with foundations, with producers. Right. We have people in the room saying, wait a second, and supporting that Native director, right? That not every little thing has to be explained. So if you look at the history here, I just saw Fiddler on the Roof right down here, and it's in Yiddish. Now, that is so important if you think about the canon altogether in theater. Mm-hmm. What does that mean, right? That means that in the beginning, if you see the history of Fiddler on the Roof, nobody wanted to do it. But it's done in their paradigm, in even the original, about their religious prospects. So I say, I'm not saying for us to do another Fiddler on the Roof. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that we have stories to tell. And why not? Why not?
Yeah.
But it's close. Do you know what I mean?
Totally.
So if it's good for one, it's good for another. That's what I mean.
Yeah. And what's it like in the Bay Area?
Oh gosh, cultural appropriation is such like a.
Yeah.
Did you just laugh, Doctor? It's just like. It's a big topic, and I'm glad people are really passionate and engaged in that conversation. So I saw Slave Play last night, and I'm so glad I did. There's a line and a moment in it that I was like, I thank Jeremy O. Harris for that moment as a Native person descended from the occupants of this continent prior to any other history. I needed to hear, and it was an African-American character who says this line, and I was like, it was sort of an accident that I, took that in. So I feel like, I just want to say, like, things aren't binary. And I think that's something we know as Indians, is that we're like, it's not that either orness. Yeah. And that's what's probably gotten us, a lot of us into trouble. It gets me into trouble. It really does a lot. And I think that when we think of like, oh, you can write it, but I can't, or I can't write it, but you can. Can't we all write?
Oh, and what were you doing with Tiger Bear? So, like, what is your philosophy with how you're working with Native stories and people?
Oh gosh, it's so new, but I can tell you something that I'm planning to do. So I come from, really privileged background. I was raised very suburban, very middle class. I'm two-spirit. I am married to a man who owned a house that's on this Indian land. When I saw that house, I thought, I don't deserve to be in this house. I deserve to work here. I literally had that thought. And I thought, that's bullshit. You know what? I actually deserve a man like this who has worked hard enough to get this house and have that relationship. And I thought, so I got that. What do I do with that? And I've been thinking about like what I could do. And I thought, you know what I want to do? I want to take some projections and I want to project like images of the Agua Caliente tribe and the Cahuilla Indians on our house and have some sort of theater event so that what we have in the present is interlaced with what's part of the past and that land, if that makes sense. So it's very new, raw and new in my head. And I invite you all to come out and make some Native plays out there. It's kind of it's no pun intended, it's a bare stage, the desert, but it really, it really is. It's just ripe for, some great theater.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And Vibrina, with your company, what are your thoughts?
Well, I don't really have a company. I'm kind of loosely doing things. But I do want to, emphasize Murielle's point of allies. I did produce a stage reading recently by a native or a Lumbee playwright. It's something I've been wanting to do for years and years and years, and finally was able to put that together. And the fact that I had allies who completely said, yes, if you want that, yes, that's a lot. We need to talk about everything you want. And so that's huge. I would also say for me, one of the big things and that people, both natives and non-natives, do not seem to understand, it is really important to have natives in all kinds of positions. I have a lot of practical experience as a designer, and it's great to have designers who are native, who are working on native pieces, not just native playwrights. It's great to have technicians, somebody to run sound or lights or whatever. They are going to bring a different sensibility to the project. And I see so many projects where you've got a native playwright or someone who's telling the story or a native choreographer, and they are the only native person that is part of the production. And I'm not saying don't do that. I'm not saying it's bad. It's just, we need more people. I want to work with more people. All of the people who worked on my, let me see. So I had a native playwright. I'm Lumbee. Actually, everybody who were principals were Lumbee. And what was great about this play reading was people who were Lumbee got to understand the play on a lot of different levels. People who were not Lumbee still understood the play, but they just didn't get it as deep. So that's why I feel like it's important to have a lot of people who are part of the production who understand the cultural stuff, because they can feed in sound or images or staging or whatever that the native folks are going to get and the non-native folks might get or might not get. And again, I'm not saying it has to be that way, but it's important. And there was one other question you had. Oh, well, I don't know. Maybe I'll answer it later. but I would love to go out to Palm Springs area and work out there. I love that area. So
We've got a guest room.
Yeah, I want to add something just to I want to challenge us a little bit more and push us a little bit harder to think about this idea of allies. And I mean, coming back to voter suppression happens because people are building power. Voter suppression isn't happening in places where people aren't voting, aren't shifting power. So, every rural place in the country, and I pulled out my IDs because I was thinking about this. Some people, like in the last election, might have heard some stuff on the news. There's Indians are not being, there's voter suppression happening. What are they really talking about? Well, everybody in rural America knows we make up our damn street names because there's not 911 addresses. Like my IDs that I pulled out right on here, my PO box is PO Box 358. But in order for me to have a credit card, for have a mortgage, to borrow money, I have to have a physical address. Well, there wasn't no physical addresses in our community, so I made up the address, 358, which is my PO box, Freedom Road, because I feel like I'm free. But every rural person, everybody in rural America makes up their addresses. I was able to get a mortgage off of this address. Every credit card, like when you apply for loans and all that, they acknowledge this as an address. It doesn't show up in those different places. But then what ends up happening is technically this ID that I've lived my whole life with, if they choose, which they did in North Dakota, to enforce the law that this doesn't match a true physical address, then they enforce that law. And therefore me, who've been going to the same precinct for the last 15, 20 years, all of a sudden can't vote. That's voter suppression happening in the 21st century. That's what happened in North Dakota. It's a reality that exists in rural America. There's solutions brewing and technology solutions that are out there. There's plus codes that are out there that can be created. There's the Rural Utah project that is doing some of this work of actually using plus codes to put up street signs in rural places. So there's solutions brewing there. But I want to come back to this idea, what we are battling here is white supremacy and white supremacist constructs that come in and affect poor communities and low-income communities of color. And I got to this idea where, fuck, I don't need allies. This is what I'm saying, is I need accomplices. Because we are dismantling some shit here, and it's real. Because the difference between, and I was talking to my kids about this, because I would try everything out on them, this idea of, all right, let's say somebody jumps you at school. Your ally, he or she or they might be the one putting their hands in the pocket like, I don't know. I don't really want to get involved in all that. I'm here if you need me. Your accomplice is the one who jumps in there, who's going to help you, who's going to be your accomplice in dismantling some shit that is destroying your lives and having power over you. And so I would urge us to think about not how you be a good ally, and I won't go to those panels that talk about that anymore, but how do you actually become an accomplice for one another and an accomplice in building power and shifting power. And so I encourage us to really do that. And so with Indian Collective, the conclusion I've come to, I've been engaging philanthropy and been engaging with philanthropy since I was about an organizer at 17 years old, and I'm 37 now, so for 20 years. And I've seen a decline in philanthropy to Native people. And so, which is only 0.3% of all philanthropy in America. It actually goes to Native people to solve causes, which is less than about $100 million. And I basically come to the conclusion that we have to build indigenous-led institutions of philanthropy and investment to shift power. Because when you have indigenous people who have lived experience in being indigenous and doing the work in indigenous communities, how philanthropy is going to looks very different. What it also does is in order to shift that, we have to take money and we have to take power from where it currently lies. And so one of the things that NDN is doing is we're in the process of building a $50 million annual grant-making fund, which would make us the biggest funder in the history of philanthropy dedicated to indigenous people. We also only fund projects that are 100% indigenous. And it is not to say that mixed groups aren't doing good work, but we fund organizations which boards are 100% indigenous, staffs are 70% indigenous. The reason why we do that is because if you look at where the resources are, I hate to say it, if you got white people, you got access. It's the reality. And so there's a reason for this, right? Because all of a sudden, if you have an all indigenous group in philanthropy becoming the biggest funder in the space, what ends up happening, you begin to shift the power dynamic that exists. All of a sudden, you're the one setting the dinner tables. And so this crazy idea that we came up with to really, it's an organizing strategy to build power. We launched 16 and a half months ago, and to date we've raised about 14 and a half, almost $15 million to launch this new idea, which means pretty interesting that if we reach our goals of actually having an annual grant-making fund of $50 million dedicated to indigenous people, it means that people in positions of power, privilege, where the money lies to actually fund like all native theaters, to fund work like this, it means that people would have had to give up money, and they would have had to give up decision-making power, and they would have had to surrender that to people closest to the pain, closest to the problem. And so I, when I think about these things of voter disenfranchisement, and I think about, when we think about power, we have to talk about structural, fundamental shifts in power, because it will change the landscape in which we live and operate in.
Can I just, sorry, if I could just respond to that. It reminds me that the phrase "by any means necessary" has been ringing in my head for a long time, and sometimes I think very much in this linear direction. And one of the gifts we have is the 4 directions, and it's not always that. It's what you were saying about the local politicians and local elections. It's sort of like the change happens on these vectors that I don't always think about, that are on my left or right, or not just right in front of me necessarily. So it's not by any means necessary, it's now by every means necessary. And we don't each have to take on all of that, but if we each take on some of that, the change can happen. And I'm sorry, you were talking about slowness, yes. Mm-hmm. Doctor, maybe you'll know this from recovery, but there's this saying in recovery that if you change your course of degree by even 1 degree, because of the curve of the earth, you end up in a totally different place than you started out from. Mm-hmm. You don't have to change very much to get into a different place altogether eventually.
If I may, I agree with both things. I do agree that if we're going to change the language, and I think it's very important that we start changing language if we're going to do it. And it has to go into legislation, it has to go into foundations, and it has to go into the way we think about theater, right? Mm-hmm. And nonprofits, okay? And one of the main things that we have to remember is the main thing with language is urgency. Right, and this is the second time I've been talking about this a lot today, and once again, a lot of places, philanthropists come into our communities and they say it's urgent you deal with Native theater. We're going to give you this money because it's urgent. What is urgent to Native? Every Native community has a different urgency, and my urgency is completely different than what's going on. Yes, bottom line, we're all Native peoples, but my urgency here in New York City is for us to have a voice, right, in this big city here, and for us to tell stories that isn't only one way. Your urgency is to tell, voter suppression, I keep on bringing it back to that, or voter suppression, and those things that are happening because civil rights are being violated. Right, and I remember saying this to someone, you want to talk about sustainability, and I was talking to a big funder about sustainability, and I said, this is what you need to do. You want to give money to these communities, these rural communities, they need funding for treaty rights in legislation. They need money for those places that don't have running water. They need the education on what does that sustainability mean, right? economic sustainability, because that is a big power source in this country, because this country is based on capitalism, right? So, and they say that to us. That's why we have problems with healthcare. This is why we have problems with real estate. We see the gentrification here, and it's moving out westward. We see that happening, and it's all because of capitalism. And I'm not saying that we can't make a living. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that we have to remember what is urgent and what is critical to our communities. And every community has a different urgency and critical issue that they are dealing with in this country. In this administration, everything is critical. That's what I am finding, right? There's not one way, and it's the thing with allyship and accomplices. This is what happens with allyships that I find. That non-Indians come and they want to be our allies, and I hear you what you're saying, and they want to have a say in the room. And we're saying, no, this is our room, this is our movement. We're your allies, and we have a say. And we'll say, no, that's white privilege. So that's where I agree with you, that if we're not going to use the word allyship, and if we continue to use the word allyship, what does allyship mean to us compared to what it means with other marginalized people of color in this nation? So that's kind of, and I agree with you, like if we change the shift, that means we have to have allyship / accomplice training. Right? No, you can't say that. Smack. I don't know. How dare you smack? No. I don't know. Run across this room with these weights. Now I know what it means to be an Indian. Here's some bread. I don't know.
Well, it's an interesting, I was talking to someone who worked in the State Department until very recently about this, and he said, the left is going to lose the election in 2020 because the left doesn't want to take up guns to protect or fight for what they want. And what you're saying is like, actually, Indians are.
Always.
So, maybe there is a kind of like, just know, ally accomplice, that if it really got bad, you'd be responsible for doing this.
Yeah.
And I'd be there with you.
I really like you.
True.
But we're hoping that it stays there.
Should I do this, Rhiana, since you hate when I do that? But no, I agree. Like, there has to be.
Term accomplice, because it means, or for me, it means that the person has skin in the game. And by that, I mean they have to think about the whole project as a whole, not just, okay, I'm going to put this piece in and I can just sit back and see how it operates. I would say the person I worked with most recently was probably, I would call them an accomplice, if that's kind of the definition, because they did everything I asked and were really pretty much in it. I want to go back to Rhiana's question about how to look at this idea. I'm sorry.
Imagining the future?
Yeah, and how it might work with plays or performances. So I thought about a little bit about that when I got invited to be part of this, and the conversation is really being generative as well. And I guess I'm really thinking about staging the process of voting and putting it on stage would be very interesting in my community. So that's, I can see doing that. I don't know if it would be a short piece. I like to do short pieces lately, and I'm working on other things. I'm like, oh no, yet another thing to work on. But I think it would be pretty powerful and interesting to do something like that and address some of the issues that have come up, both that I know about happens in my community, but other issues that people have talked about, and maybe even kind of look at the idea of what is an ally versus what is an accomplice versus what is someone who just wants to come in and throw money at a problem, but doesn't really want to engage more than that, and kind of expects things to happen on their time frame without looking at the dynamic of the community or group or issue within the community itself or the situation itself.
Yeah. Before we move to Q&As, I want to make sure to have some time for Nick to talk about Radical Imagination, which your voting play sounds like it would be a really great match for this.
Yeah, so I'll keep it short. So NDN does all kinds of different grant making. We're Indigenous grant maker to fund Indigenous-led efforts. We recently, in 2020, are launching a partnership with the Cerda Foundation out of New York City here, America's second oldest foundation. And the whole philosophy behind this is radical imagination. And this idea of giving grants to Indigenous artists, storytellers, playwrights, to radically imagine what does the future look like that we are fighting for. In the event that we win these elections, in the event that we stop climate change, in the event that we begin to build a world that is founded in justice and equity for all people on the earth, what does that actually look like? And empowering and investing into radical imagination of Indigenous storytellers to think about that, and making sure that we're connecting, not just funding artists for the sake of artists' sake, but funding artists to radically imagine that, and making sure that those artists are deeply connected to movements for social change in the country, and community-based organizations who are actively fighting in pursuit of that work. And so that we're closing the gap between organizers, activists, and people doing long-term systemic work, and the artists that are helping us radically imagine that. It's an awesome grant-making program that we're launching in 2020, and our whole concept is that, like, our storytellers and our artists, they're the interpreters of our culture. They're the thing that connects generations, and there's such a spiritual power that exists in that. And so this grant making program that we're launching is to do that. Being an organization that has come out of the Indigenous peoples movement, we are making are going to make sure that work is deeply connected to the long-term systemic goals that we're fighting for, but also recognizing that these projects of radical imagination will fuel what organizers, activists, movement builders are doing on the ground, and hopefully that it changes and helps us sharpen our spear of how we're actively doing this work more and more. And so in the spirit of that, like, I've always struggled to think about a vision that includes Indigenous people and includes all people that we're fighting for. And one thing that we use to guide our work at NDN Collective is the Policy Link Equity Manifesto. It's a manifesto put out by a national organization called Policy Link, and I wanted to read this as a way to go into the questions. Okay. It's short, don't worry. So this is a manifesto. It was put together by Policy Link, but within concert with over about 127 community-based organizations throughout the nation. It begins by joining together, believing in the potency of inclusion and building from a common bond. It embraces complexity as a cause for collaboration, accepting that our fates are inextricable. It recognizes local leaders as national leaders, nurturing the wisdom and creativity within every community as essential to solving the nation's problems. It demands honesty and forthrightness, calling out racism and oppression, both overt and systematic. It strives for the power to realize our goals while summoning the grace to sustain them. It requires that we understand the past without being trapped in it, embrace the present without being constrained by it, and look to the future guided by the hopes and courage of those who have fought before and beside us. This is equity, just and fair inclusion into a society in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. Unlocking the promise of the nation by unleashing the promise in us all. So I wanted to just share that as we think about what we are radically imagining, for the future that we could be building together and what accomplices could be helping to build. Yeah.
Yes. Does anybody have any questions?
I do. So there's a lot of parallel between conversations that are arising right now in Black communities. And we're seeing that also being expressed in art. You saw slave trade?
Slave play.
Slave play, sorry. I haven't seen it. But there's also other things that are coming out right now. Do you think that there's an opportunity to harness that voice? Because there is this sense that folks are talking so much about different cultures that are being stolen in art, etc. And everybody needs to have that expression. Do we think that there's room to bring some of this together to get people to recognize it's all fighting for the same thing, and by using the art to amplify voices about how, on the local level, that we all can make those changes within our community through collective art of peoples that are oppressed?
Absolutely. I wouldn't be doing this if it was only for, I tell Native stories, yes, but I want everyone to understand a Native story, because my story is your story, right? Your story is my story. There's one basic thing that we all have in common in this country, is a thing called the doctrine of discovery. That if you're not a Christian, you were not considered human. So when they came to all of our shores or any of our bases, if you were not a Christian, you were not considered, and that is legally in a lot of things. You see this in health. You see this with treaty rights. You see this with water rights. You see this with voter suppression, and you see it in theater. So if we can get together with that and say that the African American community and the Native community, who are extremely marginalized, and the country was built on the backs, if we can talk about those two things, speak about it, have a conversation where it doesn't become this competition on who has the I did a play called the Genocide Olympics, and I had 6 different people here, and they all competed, and at the end someone shoots them all. It was a big story, but it was a big play I did, and I wanted to make the point that when we start doing the Genocide Olympics, when we start competing, who's had it worst, we all die. If we're all fighting for oxygen, who gets the oxygen mask, we all lose air.
Race to the bottom.
Yeah, come on. So we have to understand we're in this together, especially with this government that we have, right? Right now, right? And I think that, an immigrant story, I think an African American story, we just talked about Fiddler on the Roof. Fiddler on the Roof, as a Native person, I did my dissertation on it, was about how I understood it as a Native person. I understood all of those fights. I'm not Jewish, but I understood all of those fights. I understood those songs, tradition. I understood what that meant, and I really got that. So if that can happen with the story, that's what I love about theater, because it can mean something. To me, it is a sacred place that you can hear one story, understand one story. Oh, my uncle is just like that. This happened to me. Oh my God, this is a creation story that my great-grandmother told me. I didn't know Indians had creation stories like that. You know what I mean? So that's my belief system in theater itself.
I want to say yes, and I almost want to say no, because I don't think that there's any good in cultural appropriation. So if you were taking a basic philosophical concept from a community and a culture, I don't think that's okay. If you want to use the concept of walk-in beauty outside of the Navajo context, that is damaging Navajo people and the time immemorial and of how we have come to be who we are, and that is damaging to us. So I would say yes, we are in the U.S. battling these politics, but no, we don't want to continue to create harm.
Well, I think, and when I've seen a basis of this, of what you're saying too, is what has also happened. We have we have Columbus Day, the one day in the year that we're allowed to complain and fight. So what happens?
You come to Minnesota, we have a lot more
We
days
do.
we
So
can
we're here. We're here fighting. But one day in New York City, we can complain and fight, right? So what happens? Can you share that as equal equity with the immigrant community and the African American? Of course, Native people in New York City freak out, and everyone. I don't understand why you won't share the day. I was very quiet, and then I finally said, "You don't understand why they don't want to share the day. The one day, the 1 month we have to complain and fight as much as we want. You don't understand why we get upset because we have to share those little things." But those are set up really, and I have to disagree with you, Rhiana. And I don't disagree very
Well,
often.
don't use Washington. I will be after you.
Never. Oh yeah, I'm scared. But what I'm saying is that there's a difference between cultural appropriation and a cultural appreciation.
Right.
And I think that's the difference. That's what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
I would love, thank you. I've been taking notes. I feel like I'm back in grad school and I'm just learning. I'm just so grateful and appreciative. I would love to hear from each panelist on what you think about Elizabeth Warren. Her claims of being, was it charity? Was that what she claimed? I would love to hear fully candid reactions. What was it when you heard it then, and what is it as you've heard it now? Or how do you feel about it now?
I'll jump into this because I had a moment recently where I work in tech, and there's AISES, AISES, the American Indian Society for Engineering and Science, and there is a chapter on the Stanford campus, and somebody put out a call on our work Slack channel. Hey, are there any natives who work here? And I was like, yeah, I'd like to know that. Is there anyone besides me? But I said, yeah, I do. And it turned out they were looking for someone to go and speak there. So long story short, the person who was asking is a member of that chapter, but she had, God bless her, a very Hebrew name, which I recognized. I was just like, so finally I was like, I'm going to ask her like the thing that people always say to me, which is like, so how did you get to be part of this group? And her answer like illuminated the Elizabeth Warren thing. She said, I was born in Indonesia, and I was going through my college applications so fast that I checked American Indian without thinking about it. And then they pulled me into this group because they were so happy there was another American Indian at Stanford. And I thought, I think I can forgive Elizabeth Warren and people who make mistakes like that because I want to forgive this girl. This other person, I shouldn't say girl, but this person who's made a mistake, and I make mistakes, you know what I mean? And like, we can all call it out, and like, I was like, damn, And then, I know, Liz Cheney, I don't want to even talk about that.
Dr. Colorado, would you like to answer?
It's actually Coronado.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
That's okay. And you can call me Vibrina. I don't generally use doctor. Anyway, I don't have a huge problem with Elizabeth Warren. Here's my deal. I've read a lot about her when she claimed Native, why. There are many, many people who say they have Native heritage, who may or may not. It's part of their, family mythology, legend, stories. And from what I saw, it seemed like she was sincere in her belief that she had Native heritage. I guess where I kind of step off the that track with her is it's like she, and I would say this about anybody. So why didn't you try to connect to a Native community? Why didn't you try to connect? And, that's the connections, for me as a Native person, is so important. So that's where I really am. I just have problems with her. And also that she was goaded enough by Trump to go take a DNA test, which doesn't really prove anything, because community connection is much more important than anything else. So I have mixed feelings about her, but I would say I think that things were, the whole situation with her was blown out of proportion, and I feel like Trump had a big part in that. But I also want to say I'm not offended or do not have problems with Native peoples who feel much stronger about it than I do. I guess I feel like there's bigger fish to fry. That's mine.
Well, I can't stand this question because it has taken up too much space since the time that it has happened. And there's much bigger issues to be working on. And the reality is, should she win, she will not be the first Native American president. 100%. And that is a widely accepted opinion throughout indigenous communities. Because heritage and lived experience is two different things. And, many of friends, like in the movement, we talk about this even with many friends in the movement for Black Lives. If I had a grandfather that was part Black, right? My lived experience is being Indian today in the 21st century. If we start claiming all of these different things, although it's part of our heritage, and heritage and lived experience is two different things altogether. And we have to realize that if we're going to deal with race in America in the true systems of power and oppression that exist in today, we have to talk about how this affects our lived experience today. And so the problem with it is there was a very unprincipled thing that she did. There was a benefit that existed for being Native American, even though she has no lived experience of being Native American at all, and didn't desire to be until it made a sense on a college application. I agree 100% that responding like that this narrative of Trump, responding to Trump, is a terrible thing that we need to do to shift power. We can't be responding to what he, she has, taken ownership of this to a certain extent, and we reached out and realized you should reach out to many Native leaders, especially Indigenous women leaders in the country, and acknowledge that this was, this was handled the wrong way. But I think it's, if I end up voting for Elizabeth Warren in the next election, I'm endorsing Elizabeth Warren because she's the lesser of two evils. Mm-hmm. Let's be clear about that. Not because I think that she has Native American, that she was, it's just, I think it's an important thing to talk about as a framework of lived experience and lived reality. But also, let's be real, again, coming back to not just white supremacy, but white supremacist constructs that make their way into how we make decisions and do things. And that is a bigger part of this conversation. And so it is really important that we do not get lost in that we are definitely in a battle for justice and equity, freedom and liberation in this country. And like that is a reality. And so these are distractions. The whole Elizabeth Warren thing is a whole entire distraction that was put in place by the other side and got sucked into it. And that is a result of white supremacist constructs making their way into the lived realities that we have to face today. That's my opinion about it.
I agree. I feel the same way. This conversation has taken so much space, you know, and I think it really comes from lack of education, but people don't understand that Native people have to prove we're Native in this country. And I don't think most people know that. And that was the reaction, right? That was the big reaction that we've had. You know, here we're fighting for every little thing. Communities are truly fighting for every little thing. And with amongst ourselves sometimes, you know, we deal with a thing called blood quantum. That's real. That is real. And so having a lived experience is very different than having a heritage. You know, I do believe the same thing, that it's like the Greek myth of the golden apples as you run the last part of the marathon. Right? That's what this is. You know, these are the distractions that are here. And I'm in agreement. I will vote for Elizabeth Warren, not because she said she was Native. I'm going to vote for her because she's a woman and I want to see a woman president. And I believe in her platforms. But do not get it twisted that she did make a faux pas and she did not, and what I find offensive, but I don't want to, you know, I want a different administration in. That is my bottom line. Yeah. So if I have to fight with everybody to get this administration out, to bring democracy into our mandates, for Native people to have their rights that we signed treaties for have the rights that for us to live, for this lived experience, for allies, accomplices, to hide us if we're going to be out there, you know, really fighting. I believe that if Elizabeth Warren is going to be running for president, and if she's a real runner, and if that is going to happen, I'm going to vote for her, right? But give us some other people too on these democratic platforms, you know. And I do believe it's taken up a lot of space because we are fighting for voting rights. We are fighting for those things.
Yeah, absolutely. She has experienced nothing that a Native woman actually has to experience in this world. I totally agree with Nick. I totally agree with everything everybody has said here. And it's actually the subject of a play I'm writing about, the way that white-passing Native people are complicit in white supremacy. And as you know, I mean, because of Elizabeth Warren, for the first time in my life, somebody called me Pocahontas. So that wasn't fun. So that, I'm sure, is happening all over the country. So, but I know that we're at our time. So I just want to thank you, Jenna, so much for making this happen. And thank you, Drama Skill. Thank you, Joey. And thank you so much to our panelists. I just always am just so honored to hear the things from the friends that I already know and new friends that I'm making, and just want to thank you all for coming and being a part and listening to this.
Thank everyone at home.
Thanks,
Everyone at home. Thank you.
I've got all the pens. Forgot everything.